I had had dinner with he and his wife, and he told me that he'd just been handed this hovercraft that was his command. Mm-hmm. So that's why I kept going on about Kelly, and we all live in a khaki hovercraft. And Yellow Submarine had been out a little while and was
kind of fit nicely there.
So there I was, 23 years old, and doing all of that insane stuff on the radio. And then it all, of course, came to a crashing end because the British government finally figured out a way of closing us down. They had sent Navy ships to go screaming past us within about 4 feet and trying to upset the apple cart. We had had a boarding party once come on board and steal the frequency control crystals out of the transmitters. And we were off the air for a couple of days because of that. And that wasn't any of the other pirate stations. That was obviously an agency of the British government. So eventually they passed a white paper, a bill in the Houses of Parliament that made it illegal for any British subject to work for them, for the pirates, any British company to advertise with them, any British record company to provide them with music, and any tendering company, British, to supply them with anything British. No British food, no British cigarette. And most of the pirate radio stations complied. We had a deadline, and all shut down on that particular day, except Caroline, that kept going. They went off to the coast of Holland. Eventually, what the British government also did was extend territorial waters from 3 miles to 12 miles, which put us out in the middle of just ugly, ugly water, at least where we were originally was pretty sheltered. And then there was that movie that came out a while back,
Yes, I was going to ask you about that.
Which was just, there were 2 things that were true about that movie. There was a radio station on a ship and the music that they played in that time. What they didn't get was the rights for the Beatles. But for everything else, they played it. And the rest of it was just nonsense. There were no wild sex parties, no drugs, lots of rock and roll. I watched about a half of that pirate movie. Somebody sent me a pirated copy of it before it was released in North America. I got halfway through and couldn't stand to watch anymore. And what was really disappointing for a lot of the former pirate radio disc jockeys was that the producers of that movie had talked to a lot of the former pirate disc jockeys and got the story, or a lot of stories. They didn't use any of it.
Yeah, well, that happens all the time.
And they Hollywoodized it, and now nobody's going to do a real story about the pirate radio stations. It was just garbage. It would have been a much better movie and much more interesting and lasted a lot longer in the movie theaters and sold more DVDs if they'd done the real story.
The real story, of course. Well, that happens so often with so many.
Just idiocy.
Everything has to become Hollywood, right? So what was your call name on the shows?
My on-air name was Errol Bruce.
Errol Bruce.
I just dropped the Knapp.
Oh, okay.
Part of that, too, was when I went into the Army following my dad's footsteps. He was a Canadian British Army Sergeant Major. And I went to so many schools and we got shuffled around the world that the only way I survived in school was I was constantly the new guy, but I was the class clown always. And I never did any work because there was never any consequences for me, except that when I was 15, I got streamed out of school. And my dad, being the Sergeant Major, said, well, you have a choice. You can go into the Army or you can go into the Army. So I went into the Army at 15 as an Army apprentice and was in the Royal Signals. So when I went into the Army at 15, some idiot clerk or clock somewhere had typoed my last name. And it was on all the documentation. When I arrived, to my horror, I discovered my name was Crap. K-R-A-P-P instead of K-N-A-P-P. So until it got changed, the first 3 months I was in the Army, everybody called me Crap. And you couldn't answer back because you were just a junior, and you couldn't correct sergeants. So when I started in radio, I thought, I'm just going to drop the Knapp and just use my first 2 names, Errol Bruce. And that's the way I was, Boss Cat Bruce, and, back in them days.
What did you do after you were
after pirate radio? I traded for quite a while on being a former pirate disc jockey. did a lot of clubs and guest disc jockeying in ballrooms, and eventually ended up partners in a club in Portsmouth in England, Royal Navy Town. Actually in Southsea, which is a suburb of Portsmouth. There was a club there called the Birdcage. And my partner was Ricky Farr. His dad was Tommy Farr, who was a heavyweight boxing champion right after the war in the UK. And before the war, he was the only guy who knocked down Max Schmeling, who was Hitler's boxing champion. Ricky and I met up and decided that we would run the Birdcage Club in Southsea, but call it Brave New World after the Aldous Huxley book. Spent a lot of time and a lot of money doing that place up. Our business partners ran a couple of bingo halls and made a lot of money, put a lot of money into this beautiful, beautiful club. And Ricky had been around the showbiz scene for many, many years, as I had. And we booked some amazing acts into Brave New World. One of the first big ones was The Who. Brian Auger and Julie Driscoll and the Crazy World of Arthur Brown and Pink Floyd and in the early days of those bands. And then I thought I'll try and get into BBC and couldn't. BBC, not so much now, but in the early days of when the Pirates were closed down and they had switched over, they called it Radio 1. You had to submit your shows in triplicate, scripted, every word you were going to say on the radio and timed out. And it was like, I don't want to do this, but I want to work radio. My mother and dad and my sibs were here in Canada already. So I thought, I'm just going to go to Canada. So I sold up my shares in the club for an airfare and arrived here in 1968. Yeah. And ended up working in Canada. The first hockey commentator, the live game caller, was Foster Hewitt. And Foster Hewitt had a little AM station here, CKFH, as in Foster Hewitt. And Keith Hampshire, who had worked on Caroline as well, was already here. He was on air there, put in a good word for me. It took me a couple of months to get in to do the all-night show there, because I talk funny, so I was told. And the all-night show was an R&B show, R&B and blues. And so there I am on the radio talking about R&B and blues, and the brothers are calling me saying, how come you know so much about our music, man? Because I was on Radio Caroline and broke all the Stax and Volt and Atlantic and Motown music that happened in Europe way before it happened in North America. So anyway, so I worked for CKFH, got a little involved with somebody who broke my heart. I couldn't. She did the last tobacco commercials in Canada before there was a ban on cigarette advertising, and she had gone down to Acapulco and they had shot this very tall, very beautiful young woman walking along the beach, Silver Beach, with this gray horse, and not only did they do the commercials, I could avoid those. But everywhere I went in the city, there she was, on the back of buses, bus stops, billboards, newspapers. And she had come back from Acapulco and said, I don't want to be with you anymore. And I went, oh, no. And that was my first heartbreak. So I ran away to Tucson, Arizona, along with an American disc jockey who was also working at CKFH, Gene Thayer and his Hawaiian wife, Mary Allen. They had a little notchback VW. We rented a U-Haul trailer, threw his record collection in, my record collection in, and we headed for Tucson, Arizona. And we arrived actually in Tucson, Arizona the day that Get Back hit the airways in Tucson, and the disc jockey on the radio as we were driving in at sunrise was all here's a brand new one by the Beatles, Get Back. And it's JoJo left his home in Tucson, Arizona. So I always said, well, I arrived in Tucson the day that JoJo left. It was my story. Had a wonderful time down there, worked for some American radio stations. Back in 1969, They'd heard some of them on the radio and the TV, but they'd never had a live one among their midst talking like this. So I had a wonderful time down there. Eventually, I was talked into coming back to Toronto to run John Lennon Yoko Ono's Peace Station radio network. I was their network coordinator. That was right around the time of the Bed-In for Peace. Cashboard and Billboard and Cashbox had offered them a full-page free ad. And so they decided that they would have a Peace Station radio network to tie in with the Toronto Peace Festival, because they lent their names to having a Toronto Peace Festival after Pop 69 in 1969, where John played with the Plastic Ono band, and Yoko was in a bag yowling on stage. But anyway, so they did the Bed-In for Peace, and then they decided that they would do the Peace Festival here in Toronto, and so they put an ad in Billboard and Cashbox, and they got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of radio stations all wanted to be part of the Peace Station network. They needed somebody to do it. So, because I had known them from my Army days at the Star Club in Hamburg, where we used to go when I was in the Army, and there was this Liverpool band playing there. Before the days of Ringo, there was Stuart Sutcliffe and Pete Best at the Star Club. Anyway, so managed to organize that, but then all the crazies started coming out of the woodwork. In Toronto, the Martians were coming in their spaceships, and which is interesting in view of the things that Tom and I ended up doing together.
That's right.
Yeah. Anyway, it all blew up in the organizers' faces, and John wrote Instant Karma, because the name of the production company for the Peace Festival here was Karma Productions. Instant Karma is going to get you was the song that he wrote after the Peace Festival blew up. And then after that, I did a lot of corporate showbiz. And then in 1994, I got involved with UFOs. That was an interesting how you and I met.
Very. So let's hear the story now.
Well, I had gotten my first computer was an Atari, and I had spent $800 on buying a modem to go online with my little Atari computer. And that was at a time when it wasn't the Sightings TV show. What was the name of that TV show? Anyway, it covered the CARP incident, the so-called UFO landing outside Ottawa in Canada. And a woman had called a friend of mine and asked him if he knew anything about, because she knew he was online, and did he know anything about UFOs and what had happened outside CARP? And he said no, but I have a friend in Toronto who probably be able to help you out. And she was calling from Ottawa, where I was at the time she made the original call to my friend Michael. And so when I got back, I found a voicemail from Michael explaining about this woman and asked if he could give her my number and to talk about what I knew about UFOs and the CARP case. And all I knew was what I'd seen on Unexplained Mysteries back in 94. So anyway, she called me. We had this long discussion. I told her what I was reading online on the old bulletin board networks back in those days, before the days of the internet. And when we finished our conversation, she said, I have a friend in Toronto who might be interested in speaking to you. And all of this happened the morning that I flew off to Ottawa to shoot video. I had read the MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network's bulletin board system, and said, when I come back I have to get in touch with MUFON. So all of these phone calls went down. She said, I have a friend, do you mind if I give him your number? And I said, no, not at all. And 5 minutes later, 72 hours after I had said I have to get in touch with MUFON, the phone rings and this voice says, hi, I'm Tom Theophanis. I'm the Director of Investigation with MUFON Ontario. Boy, put it out to the universe and sometimes it comes back at you real fast. And that's how Tom and I met.